immense pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to our most valued invited resource person, all the participants and my fellow colleagues on behalf of Women's Studies Center, Madurai Kamaraj University, Madurai, and Department of Women's Studies, Bharathidasan University, Tiruchirappalli, for the fourth day of one-week gender sensitization program on understanding social structure and gender in collaboration with the University Grand Commission, New Delhi, towards the pertinent area on gender and migration. Now I request Professor Dr. N. Manimegalai Madam to introduce the resource person of today's session. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you very much. So before starting the program today, we are going to have another tribute to be paid to the great activist, come researcher, come teacher, Professor Elena Sen. I think you would have heard, and there in the WhatsApp group also, Women's Studies Center group, WSC group, it was all shared. So we will spend a minute. Okay, Praveen. Good. You have joined. Welcome, Praveena.
Thank you,
Praveen. Yeah. Okay. I'm just starting about Vilina, and then we will have our 1 minute silence and then proceed. Okay. So Elena was a doyen of feminist politics, blending it with indigenous community perspectives and that of the trade union movement of Chhattisgarh. A rare blend that gave her both analytical strength and practical vision of taking on the state, patriarchy, communal forces, employer companies, and corporations that indiscriminately grabbed. So Elena she taught at different universities and also at TIS. And equally, she spent her time with the field, and she believed in whatever I have just mentioned. It is not just sitting at and doing something research without meeting and sitting with the people. So she also demonstrated the possibility that women's studies researchers must be sitting with the marginalized. It is not the middle class. So she strongly advocated that you cannot do feminism only with the middle class perspective. You have to go and work with the people, understand their issues, and then formulate theories. And Adivasi land and forest resources were the foremost areas in which she worked. And in one way or the other, her convictions and activism made her known to every sector in the civil society movement of South Asia. It is not just India. So Elena Sen is not just known to India, she is an international movement and activist person, based person, and well known in South Asian context. She insisted constantly about the need to go outside the middle class activist space and establish lively relationship with ground movements, people's organizations, as well as the trade unions. So she used to also work with the organizations, and one major organization, of course, it actually these tributes have also been keep coming from various places. And one is the India Pakistan People's Forum. They have also expressed their concern. Now IDWAS has just issued the note, and also CPIM, ML, Calcutta also sent a press note, etc. So people are keep sending. Yesterday she last breath, and now people are really paying homage from different corners. And she vehemently argued for every space to be gender sensitive. That is one of the major. So it is not that you speak, you have to also. And she was face of the public health movement, and spent many years in Chhattisgarh and worked with several trade unions and Adivasi organizations, and had moved to academics a decade ago. She taught at Mahatma Gandhi Antarashtriya Hindi Vishwavidyalaya in Wardha. Once things 4 national conference back, we had our national conference of Indian Association for Women's Studies there in Wardha, and you all know the story. Whoever participated, in between it was about to stop, and she had to really struggle, and then she was the general secretary also. And later moved to Mumbai to join the Advanced Center for Women Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and she taught, and several students also shared their own experiences of taught by Elina Sen there from TIS also. And two important books, major important books. There are some number of publications, monographs, working paper, discussion papers that Elina had produced, but there are two important pieces are Inside Chhattisgarh, a political memoir, as well as Shugavasin, the migrant women of Chhattisgarh, are among her more known written contributions to the progressive movement. But much more are the number of times her articles, concept note, and criticism have challenged each and every one of us in different moments. And she continued her lifelong association with Chhattisgarh Mukti Moksha, People's Union for Civil Liberties, and Workers' Union till her last breath. She was also the former president of the Indian Association for Women Studies, and the people who sent homages also felt that the void that Elina leaves behind is huge for all of us, and more so to the immediate family. And the only solace in this would be to, be the knowledge of how relieved she would be now from her bodily pains, because she has been suffering from the cancer for the past at least 6 or 7 years seriously. Before that also, she was in treatment, and many a time she used to come to the IWS meetings, because I used to be there when she was the ex officio member, and so we used to discuss, and some kind of responsibilities would be given to her, and she will come out with a perfect complete report or the work whatever is assigned, and she will present and interact with the EC members. And sometimes physically it won't be possible for her at all to sit and be part of the meeting, but still she will make it up. And having taken the responsibility, she won't give up. And many a time people, she was sought after for the kind of work she has been, she has done there in the Chhattisgarh context with the Adivasis, and the resources, and her husband Vinayak Sen, you all very much aware that he is a human rights activist, and she stood with him whenever he faced turmoils by the government, and when he was imprisoned, he struggled and brought him out, and he survived with her husband and two daughters, and really losing the women's studies community is losing an extreme person who right from the beginning contributed and strengthened the women's studies movement in India and as well as South Asia. So we cannot forget her contributions, and only way we can tribute her and pay back her is that we continue to work with what she has advocated for. The one is that go with sit with the people, work with the people, go to the ground, learn and do give up, or you don't just stop with the middle class feminism, middle class movement, or the issues of the women, middle class women alone. You have to go to the grassroots and do it. And also every space wherever you work, you have to incorporate gender sensitivity. So such a very lucid kind of flow and presentation would be experienced when you sit with her, and she recognized the people whoever the people without any background also she could encourage and make them or mold them such that they will be gender sensitive and adapt themselves to movements. So that is the kind of the background which I could also personally experience with her. Last EC she was there with us, and sometimes some meetings she could not come due to the extreme illness, but still she managed to listen to her. So with these words, I briefly express our sorrow to the bereaved family to come out of this loss, and also to the women's studies communities and movement. And so as a homage, let us all spend a minute with silence. This is a kind of a silence. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much for observing silence. So, on behalf of all of you, we pay homage to her by way of sharing about her in this meeting. Thank you for paying your attention to this. So, now we move on to Dr. Praveena Godot, who is going to be the resource person for today to talk on gender and migration. So, I just take some minutes to say a few words about her and leave it to her to handle the session. So, Professor Praveena is the professor of economics, basically, at Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, CDS, popularly known as CDS, and have researched several themes in the area of gender and development. So, her specialization itself is gender studies, and she teaches a course on gender and development for MA students at CDS. She has a PhD in economics and from University of Hyderabad, and she also endowed with Sir Ratan Tata Fellow and Asia Research Center, London School of Economics and Political Science in 2006. And her research themes, area of research themes include international migration of women workers, higher education, student politics and citizenship, gender and agrarian relations, political economy of dowry in Kerala, transformation of family and marriage in Kerala. So the very areas of research itself would inform what kind of work. Of course, migration is the recent work on which she has been doing, particularly the international migration, the child migration, etc. She has contributed to several publications, and it was all both in the articles and also chapters contributed in the books, which are very, very important books. And the basic areas in which she contributed could be listed as quoting legitimacy or delegitimizing custom, sexuality, about marriage norms in modern Asian times. So then she also wrote on Christian property law reform, and that was again inter-Asia cultural studies published, and dowry, female seclusion in left development context, West Bengal and Kerala in EPW, and about matrilineal was matrilineal ever any different, resisting the powerful Karnavan dominated women dichotomy in Samyukta, which is published by the Kerala University. Then also contributed to various areas in books, particularly gender aspects of family property, family structure, and women education, etc. She recently published an ILO paper on recruitment and migration on domestic workers from South India to the Middle East. That is one of the, and currently she is engaged in a study to generate evidence on child migration in India. So, her current topic of interest is about migration, where she talks about child migration as well as the international migration, which is one of the areas in which she has been working, and also the political economy of marriage in 20th century Kerala. So these are the areas, very challenging areas, and being an economist, she contributes to economic aspect as well as gender studies expert to gender and social aspects also, whichever area of investigation she has taken for her research. So this is the kind of background which we have got this resource person working on. And over to, I welcome you, Dr. Praveena, and when Dr. Radhika welcomed, I think you hadn't joined. So I welcome on behalf of all the participants and the organizing partners. Welcome, and I'm handing it over to you. So you may take around 45 minutes, and then we can start, have some 5 minutes for 10 minutes discussion. Dr. Praveena, please.
Thank you, Mani Mekale, for that very generous introduction. Will I be able to see the PowerPoint? Would you be able to show
it? It is already there. It is already uploaded.
Yeah. See the title.
So gender and migration.
Yeah. Will you be able to move it to the first?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm honored. And I've been working on migration, particularly international migration, for some time. So I'm happy really to share some of my experience in that area of work. The talk today, I'm not really going to focus so much on the detail of my own work. I'm going to try and give you a broader perspective on how migration is gendered and how the perspectives or the frameworks that are usually used in migration studies do not usually recognize or reckon with gender. And so what I will do is I will first ask this question of what is the relevance of gender to migration? Why should we be concerned with gender when we're talking about migration? And then go on to migration perspectives and ask questions that will basically sort of bring out the implicit gendering that is there, but which is often not recognized. So the first slide, as you can see, asks about the relevance of gender. Now, I'm sure in the past lectures you've been introduced to how gender organizes life, right? Who we are, what we are permitted to do, what we are expected to do by social norms, etc. These are all ways in which our lives are organized. Language, the way language is also gendered, organizes life. Similarly, gender is an organizing principle of migration, and therefore it structures migration. And this structuring is reflected in certain patterns. Now, when we say patterns, it seems somehow, power neutral, as if it's just, it's innocuous. It's not really very significant. These are just patterns that emerge. But then if you were to look at these patterns very closely, you will see how they actually reflect gendered power relations. And I've taken a couple of examples right at the beginning to sort of problematize that issue. So men migrating alone, women migrating alone, and people migrating as families or in other groups. These are the general patterns that you find. But why is it that we find that, it's mostly men who migrate alone? It's much rarer to find women migrating alone, but it's more or less permissible for women to migrate in families. But what are the contexts in which you find that men migrate alone, women migrate alone, and men and women migrate as families? If we look at these contexts more carefully, we will be able to see how they are implicated in power relations. And not only gender power relations is one aspect of it, but also caste and class are combined or intersect with gender in creating these patterns. Also, the timing of migration of men, women, and when people move in groups, timing in terms of the time factor involved in migration, whether it's long-term, short-term, seasonal, circular, cyclical. Also, at what age? The PowerPoint has gone at, the demographic characteristics of migration. So it's important, therefore, to really probe these patterns to understand the kind of power relations, gender power relations that patterns really express. So gender is not simply an organizing principle. It's not just something neutral that you organize because it's convenient to have organization, right? When we order life, it's a convenience. It's not just a convenience, but therefore, it's not just order for the sake of order. Gender is an expression of power. An organization based on gender establishes, reproduces, and sustains power relations. Now, therefore, migration is structured by gendered power relations, and migration patterns are embedded in and reflect these power relations. So it's very important to remember that. And that's what makes gender really important in understanding migration itself. For instance, macro data sets show that there are more women than men migrants, but women and men migrate for very different reasons. This is really important because we often think that migration itself is male dominated. But when we analyze the census or the NSSO, just basic analysis, you'll find that it's women who are the bigger migrants. I mean, the higher proportions of women you'll find are actually migrating than men. But then when you go a little deeper, you'll find that the main reason for women's migration is marriage, whereas the main reason for men's migration is employment. So that there comes a big difference. This is also a pattern, but you can see how power relations are involved, right? Because marriage is mandatory for women. It's very difficult for a woman not to get married in our own Indian context. It has to be a huge struggle if you want to not get married. Whereas even if a man gets married, it's the woman who follows the man after marriage to where the man lives, right? So she becomes the migrant. Whereas men move in order to take up work often. So by contrast, the main reason for male migration is usually work. Now, if gender structures migration, and I've just explained how gender structures migration. So, for instance, the fact that women migrate mainly on account of marriage, which is not the full truth, but I will get to that a little later, whereas men migrate mainly for employment, also for education and so on. So if gender structures migration, mobility is also a key aspect of how gender itself is structured. So if you think about it, just think about mobility and what that means to the way in which we structure, we give meaning to gender itself, to what gender is in our lives. We know that women's mobility is a very contentious issue. Especially a young unmarried woman's mobility is often restricted, right? So you can see mobility is the base of migration. And therefore, when mobility of women itself is contentious, you can see that it is really a key issue as far as migration and as far as gender is concerned. So social norms restrict women's mobility, especially when it is undertaken alone, independently, but male mobility is not restricted in similar ways. Women's mobility, both social mobility and spatial mobility, is seen largely in terms of marriage. So in our own different languages, if you were to think back on your own mother tongues, I'm sure there will be any number of proverbs that sort of reflect or express the importance of mobility and how women and mobility are related. In Malayalam, for instance, there are terms like when a woman doesn't get married, she's referred to as ninnu poi or irunnu poi, which translates in English as stunted. She has failed to move on. So it's also, mobility is really key to that understanding. So a woman is supposed to achieve social mobility and also spatial mobility when she gets married. This is an idiomatic expression, and languages really express the way gender organizes our lives. So you can see that mobility is very basic to our understanding of gender itself. There's another expression very interestingly in Malayalam, which is called Pura Naranju Nikkunnu. When a woman is unmarried, she weighs down the house, she fills it, she's a burden to the house. So that's another way in which mobility is used to describe the circumstance of a woman who is not married. I'll move to the next slide, please. So therefore, mobility is a resource and a highly value-laden resource. So you can see the kind of value that is placed on that resource, access to which is gender differentiated. Men have a very different kind of access to mobility than women. But you must also remember that in our traditional context, in our gender, socially conformative context, once a woman gets married, by virtue of that, she may get access to a certain degree of mobility, which an unmarried woman may not have. So that's also a way of accessing mobility. Women undertaking mobility independently for work by defying social norms would be subject to stigma. So you'll see how women are penalized socially for undertaking mobility in ways that are not acceptable to gender conservative society. But gender is not monolithic, and I have already mentioned this. It intersects with other structures of oppression, prominently caste and class, but also it also intersects with age and marital status. And I've just mentioned this fact about marriage and how it enables a certain degree of mobility. It doesn't really give you freedom, but it gives you a certain degree of mobility to shape distinctive patterns of migration. Thus, women of the oppressed castes or tribal women may face less restrictions on mobility than privileged caste women. When it's a compulsion for women to work, maybe it will be more possible for women to actually migrate. In the work that I have done on the migration of women to the Middle East from Kerala and Andhra Pradesh, I actually found that divorced and widowed or separated women, their mobility was more condoned. It's not acceptable so much as condoned by our society. It was like saying that it's all right if they're going because they don't have a choice. But if you're actually choosing to go, then that is stigmatized and you're seeing as actually breaking the social norm, and therefore you could be penalized by being stigmatized. Now, migration with families, by migration by older women or by married women may be less restricted than independent migration by young unmarried women. And yet you will find that there are contexts in which it is young unmarried women who actually migrate for work, but they will largely be from the scheduled tribes where migration is more acceptable than it is in other among other social groups. And therefore you see how gender, caste and class intersect. And it's poor women who actually undertake migration for poorly paid work like domestic work. Now, more on gender and migration patterns. Migration trends and patterns are analyzed usually through macro data. The census and the NSS are sources of data. The last round of the NSSO on migration was quite old. It was 2008. So it's more than 10 years old, but it is well known that these data systems, their concepts and categories are also influenced by gender. So often you find that the questions that are asked presume certain kinds of gender normative concepts. So migration data disaggregated by gender shows certain patterns, like that women's migration is predominantly for marriage, which is then naturalized. We tend to think, oh yes, that's part of our social reality and it's an expression of our social reality. And we assume that it's natural because they're part of our social reality. But these statistics actually hide certain dimensions of our reality. For instance, deeper analysis shows that though the main reason given for women's migration may be marriage, once a woman moves on account of marriage, she may take up employment in the destination. So that information gets lost out because we only enumerate the main reason. Whereas for men, the main reason is employment. So when you actually look at what women are doing after migration, you may find that a larger proportion of them are in the labor force or have actually found employment. So just migration for marriage does not therefore tell us the entire story. Now, I spoke hitherto about marriage. Gender, it's important to see how gender structures labor migration itself, and that's really important. Now, a large nationwide survey that was undertaken by by scholars at the Center for Women's Development Studies in Delhi found that only a quarter of women workers migrated alone, as against nearly half of male migrant workers, whereas nearly half of women migrants in their survey went with family members, and the remaining women migrated in assorted groups. So you can see that women migrating alone is a fairly small proportion of migrants, because obviously this is also not acceptable. So it's much more difficult for women to get that, whereas single men migrating alone is not that much of a problem. But then if you look conversely, you find that a higher proportion of female migrants are in the younger age bracket than male migrants. That is, if you're looking at the entire group of female migrants and male migrants separately, you'll find that among female migrants, a higher proportion of female migrants are in the youngest age group, 15 to 25. And this would mean that there are also some adolescent girls who are migrating. And what you find, if you were to analyze this further, is, and if you were to ask who are these women, you're likely to find that a fairly large proportion of them are scheduled tribe women who come from very specific regions of the country, north and northeast, Jharkhand and those areas, and also parts of Orissa, etc. So another interesting finding from research studies is that the poorest migrants move as families, whereas among the less poor, single men migrate. So if you have an option actually just to send one member, it's much more likely that you would send a adult male member. Whereas when you don't have any resources at home, the entire family is more likely to migrate. And therefore, when you find family migration among the poor, it's likely to be the worst off that undertake family migration. And within the literature, you'll see that a lot of these family migrants, they migrate with children, go into the worst kinds of occupations, like, or the most taxing and the least paid occupations, like bricklins, sugarcane cutting, construction, urban construction activity, also plantation labor. These are some of the occupations where families migrate. Now, to understand these patterns, we need to probe them further from a gender lens and also from a gender and life cycle perspective. I mentioned that among the youngest age groups, you'll find that among women, you have a higher proportion of women than you have men among the male migrants. And this has to be seen in relation also to marriage. That is, once a woman gets married, it becomes difficult for her to migrate alone, right? Then a whole lot of life cycle responsibilities come in, and then migrating alone becomes difficult. Whereas it's much easier for men, even in that age group, to migrate alone. Women then has to start, there are a whole lot of reproductive responsibilities, taking care of children, etc. And therefore, this may be one of the reasons why you find that a higher proportion of women among the youngest age groups migrate. Now, macro data on migration also suffers from gender, caste, and class bias, as they fail to enumerate seasonal migration or very short-term migration of less than 6 months. That is, in the 2008 NSSO, they actually enumerated up 6 months. If you're moving for 6 months, that was enumerated, but not less than that. Whereas a large proportion of very poor people migrate seasonally, and that may be for much shorter periods. And women's migration is predominantly in this group. Poor women's migration is predominantly in this group. And therefore, there's a way in which the macro data systems renders women's migration invisible by not enumerating it. So we don't really know how big the proportions of women are, or the numbers of women are who actually engage in migration. When you have longer term migration enumerated, it's male migration that comes to the fore. Therefore, we believe that it's men largely who migrate for work. So studies show that men and more affluent migrants engage more in longer term, long distance migration, and women and poor migrants in short-term and seasonal migration. So you can see that there's also a class bias and a corresponding caste bias, because you find that the oppressed castes are far more represented among the poor than are the privileged castes. Now, ST and ST families have a disproportionate presence in seasonal migration, which is largely to take up jobs in the areas that I just mentioned: bricklands, sugarcane production, construction, plantation, etc. A lot of which is bonded and involves the very poor condition of work. And why is it bonded? Because employers and recruiters actually pay advances before recruiting them. So the workers then have to stay and work their time out in the migrant destinations. Now you also find, 1 minute. Okay, so now what I will do is, can you move to the next slide, please? So I will now move to the, the next slide is on migration theories. So I'll take up 5 aspects that come to the fore in migration theories, and try and demonstrate how they are not gendered, but why it's important to gender them. So this is from the work of Douglas Massey, who's done a lot of work on research on international migration, and he has looked at migration theories, or elaborated these migration theories very closely. So he's brought together a whole range of theories in this. So the first point here is the structural forces in the sending regions or sending nations that create a mobile population prone to migration. So I'll take each of these points separately. And so when you talk about the structural forces in the sending regions or the sending nations, you're basically talking about supply side theories. That is, why do migrants want to supply their labor? Why do they want to migrate and work elsewhere in destinations? So basically that's what supply side theories try to explain. And the most important kinds of explanations as far as international migration have come from the world systems theory. But it's also relevant to internal migration or migration within countries, because the structural transformation of societies, or the structural transformation of the economy, is very important in understanding rural to urban migration. So, what do I mean by structural transformation of societies? That is transformation brought about by the creation and expansion of markets in the course of economic development, which generates migration. So, what does this involve? It basically involves, if you were to think back in time, economies generally start off as a subsistence economy, which means you're doing everything, you're producing everything that you need, and you're consuming what you produce. And then slowly the market really enters into the picture, which means that you can actually buy things and you can sell things, right? So there is the development of different sectors. You no longer diversify. You no longer need to just depend on your own resources and subsistence. You can actually diversify, you can sell your labor, and you can buy products from the market. Now, this involves, what the first step of this will be that you will have workers moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, or you will have them moving from poorer countries to more affluent countries. So it involves a massive restructuring of social institutions and cultural practices that displace people from their traditional livelihoods in subsistence farming, as peasant agriculture gives way to commercialized farming. And then you can also see this kind of structural transformation occurring in a different context. For instance, when state enterprises as state-dominated sectors are privatized in the former command societies, like when the Soviet Union really broke down. So that was a major structural transformation. And what you found was that within the old socialist bloc, women's employment had been very high, but it had been artificially held that way. The moment it broke down, you found a decline in employment, and you found a whole transformation, and you found that both men and women, but large numbers of women from the former Soviet states actually moved out, migrated in search of employment in other European countries. Now, if you just look at the nature of this theory, it has explanatory value, of course, but it doesn't tell us who moves. Do men move or do women move? And when do men move? When do women move? So it doesn't really get into those kind of questions. It just tells us that migration happens as if it's gender independent or gender neutral, but that's not the case. Largely, what do we find in our own context? That rural to urban migration, you find that it is male dominated, unless you look for particular kinds of very short-term migration there where you find women. So it's largely male dominated. But why is it that it is male dominated? And there you come to the whole question of gender. Then how does gender influence or shape the new economic and social structures that are gendered through structural transformation? That again is another question that we need to ask. So as economies, as societies are transformed, now what is the new kind of gendering that comes into being? Is it likely to open out and be less gender conservative, or does it work the other way? And we find that in different contexts, it works in different ways. And I mentioned the socialist, the breakdown of socialist societies, after which women actually lost out on employment. Okay, so I think you'll have to move to the next slide. Now I'm moving to the demand side. Basically, the receiving context of migrant workers. So within the national context, we will be talking about the receiving context. The receiving contexts are, to a big extent, the big cities, the urban areas, but also in places like Kerala, you find that migrant workers from other states are everywhere. Right? It's not just urban or anything, because Kerala's own workers have gone to the Gulf. So there's this large scale labor scarcity. And we have workers coming in from other places to fill that scarcity. Now, the explanation, the theoretical explanation for the demand side, why is it that workers come? What is the demand for them? There has to be some demand, right? So labor scarcity is one kind of demand, but it's not only labor scarcity. Uh, Economists talk about segmented labor market theory, which has been advanced to explain the generation of a persistent demand for low-wage migrant workers in post-industrial societies, as well as in cities and urban areas of the global south. So what you have is you have a segmented labor market, which is you have more than one labor market. And in our own context, we find an expression of this in the formal or the organized sector and the unorganized or the informal sector. They exist together, right? They're two very different kinds of labor markets. And one is a low wage sector, or at least the informal labor market has some parts of the informal labor market are not necessarily low wage, but largely there is much less labor protection there. And therefore, low wage workers tend to congregate there, whereas in the organized sector, there is a great deal more of social protection. And therefore, the organized sector is also more capital intensive with a constant demand for labor and regular forms of employment, as against labor intensive sectors with variable demand for labor and casual and flexible employment. So part-time work as against full-time work, which is much more a characteristic of regular employment. And this also corresponds to the formal-informal sector dichotomy. Now, that's the segmented labor market theory. And how this comes into being as a demand-side explanation for migration is that when you're looking at overseas migration, for instance, there are people who are being employed there and they're in regular forms of employment. But there's also demand for low-wage labor force. And immigrant labor is usually a low-wage labor force. So you see this in a big way in the Middle East, right? India sends large numbers of very less qualified workers. There are some more qualified workers, but the bulk of India's migrants are actually poorly educated workers who go to the Middle East, and they work in relatively low paying, but compared to our own context, better paying occupations. So how does gender affect the presence of male and female workforces in formal and informal sectors, or in full-time, part-time, or flexible forms of work, home working and home-based work? And you see that all of these kinds of work are very gender structured. You'll find that men have a far greater presence in full-time work. Women are found largely in part-time work, and also in flexible forms of work like home-based work, home working, etc., are areas where women are found. Now, you also find that in the context of demand-side explanations, there is a demand for female labor in certain areas, right? Particularly in certain occupations like paid domestic work, like in all kinds of care sector occupations, nursing, even teaching, some other health sector occupations. So there are areas where women are in demand, whether it is within the national borders. In the cities, you'll find that you'll have nurses actually migrating from various parts of the country to the cities, to other areas where jobs are available. You'll find that you have large-scale migration of young women as domestic workers from rural areas to the big cities, to Delhi, Bombay, and other cities. And therefore, there are crucial areas in occupational segments where women are also employed. Now, the very structuring of occupations is gendered, right? And that gives way to a gendering in migration patterns as well, because women are in already feminized occupations. These are occupations that are already associated with women, and women kind of are concentrated in, which has implications because women are so concentrated in them, wage rates tend to be lower. There's also a form of crowding out, which means not everybody can get jobs. That is the case with nurses, in fact. Then, in terms of demand side theories, it's also very interesting. Jon Breman, for instance, has used this term footloose labor. which is what you find in the sugarcane processing sector, sugarcane production sector, that is, planting and cutting of sugarcane. People are recruited in, this is mostly from the central parts of the country, central, western and parts of northern Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat. These are largely the areas where people are recruited for this work. But you'll find that there are sugarcane uh, production areas close to their homes, but they will be recruited from there and taken to work in other areas. And this is a way of using migration really to keep people moving and to keep them in forms of bondage. Because if they get work in their own areas, they may actually be able to mobilize and raise demand. So you find this kind of continuous mobility for work. And this is an area, as I said, where families migrate. And family migration has implications for women because then wages are not necessarily paid to the woman. It's paid together to the man. And so women do not get to control their wages. This is in contrast to when women migrate independently, even in forms of work like paid domestic work. Not always, they can, even then wages can be paid directly to their parents or to intermediaries. But once women kind of establish themselves, get a sense of the occupation and are able to move around on their own, they have better information, they are able to claim their own wages and control their incomes. And now, what I've been talking about just now is how a segmented labor market structure is reinforced by hierarchically structured occupational structures. So occupational segregation, which is precisely what I've been talking about, and gendered demand for migrant workers in paid domestic work, care sectors, health sector workers, all these are domains of female workers. Now, another interesting aspect of the demand side are ethnic enclaves of in labor markets for certain kinds of work, which is renders certain specificities in the demand for low-wage workers. Now we see this in Kerala, we see it elsewhere also, that you will have people from particular areas and particular states, but particular areas within states who do certain kinds of jobs, and they're preferred for those jobs. For instance, there are Bengali workers who are in jewelry making work in Kerala, in central Kerala. Large numbers of these workers are all from Bengal and from particular areas of Bengal. You have very famously plumbers from Orissa all over. You have tailors from Uttar Pradesh. So you have these ethnic enclaves which are in demand. Right, so that's also part of the demand side, and that actually creates the possibility for workers from particular regions to go. Now, again, you need to ask questions about what about women? Yeah, women, as I've mentioned, go into things areas like domestic work, and there is demand for women from these regions, and now Jharkhand, etc., which are large supplying regions of domestic workers. So, however, demand for migrant workers is also gendered through occupational segregation, which I had already mentioned. Now, the third aspect of these theories that I will deal with are the motivations of people who respond to structural conditions. So, the last 2 points I dealt with were about the structural conditions of supply and demand. Now, this is about the individual motivations. And this is really typically what neoclassical economics deals with. So explanations for the motives of those workers who respond to these structural forces and actually take up migration. Now, neoclassical theory, according to neoclassical theory, people assess the money they can expect to earn by working locally and compare it to what they anticipate earning at various destinations, both domestic and international. And the kind of, there are the expected earnings that they have, and they will think about it over a lifetime, literally, and then make the decision to migrate, is what neoclassical economics says. So basically, it depends on the opportunities, it depends on the wages, but it also depends on the regularity of work, whether you will be, be able to find work over a longer period. Now, people migrate to the location that offers the highest lifetime returns for their labor, so that in aggregate, labor flows from low to high wage areas until an equilibrium is reached. That is what neoclassical economics theory tells us. The theory assumes gender neutrality in individual behavior. Obviously, this theory would say that men and women are equally able to move, which is not true, right? Men are much more able to move to access migrant work than women are. Women, where they move, are moving only from certain areas, from certain social groups where it has become possible for them to migrate. And from other areas, you don't find them. And where women go from doesn't really necessarily correspond to the poorest areas. You may have far poorer areas from where women are not able to move. You may have privileged caste women who are very poor, but they may not be able to move, as against women from oppressed castes or women from certain areas. But also it does it does explain why people migrate from some regions, countries, and not from some others, or the direction of migration from source to the destination. It does not explain. Countries with the highest rates of emigration, especially of women, are not necessarily the poorest. On the contrary, some of them are relatively affluent. Now, if you look at international migration, and you'll find that the countries that are the largest exporting countries of female domestic workers, or women domestic workers, but also nurses, is the Philippines. And the Philippines is far from being the country with the lowest GDP, you know, and yet it is the largest sending country to the Middle East of domestic workers. Sri Lanka is a major sending country, but Sri Lanka is not among the poorest of countries. So it doesn't, neoclassical theory does not really explain why is it that people move from some locations and not from some other locations. So there's something else that we really need to look for to understand that. Now, another aspect of neoclassical theory is it's called the new economics of labor migration, which does not resort to this kind of individual-based explanation, but it argues that people undertake labor migration because it allows them to manage economic risk and to overcome missing, failed, or inefficient markets for capital credit insurance at the place of origin. So it's not just wages that or lifetime returns, but it's also managing the kind of uncertainties and risks at their source, and also if they don't have the provision to get credit to protect themselves in other ways, then they would migrate. Another aspect of this particular theory, in contrast to neoclassical theory that posits permanent migration, new economic paradigm predicts circular movement and the repatriation of earnings in the form of remittances or savings and households rather than individual decision making. So according to the new economics of migration, it's basically households that take the decision. They decide, okay, so this is probably the most reasonable thing to do to overcome the kind of risks that we have. And they will decide who to send or whether to move as a household itself. Typically, I mean, one example of this would be the migration to the Gulf. But migration to the Gulf is temporary, not because households decide that they don't want to settle down there, but it's not possible according to the laws of those countries for households to settle. So there is also that dimension. But when we look at migration within the country, we find that there are a large number of areas where men move in circular ways. So there's a lot of circulation, but they go back. They don't settle down in the destination. Rather, they send money back and they go back home. But they, for very long years, they continue to work. That is, they go and come back, but they continue to work in the destination. So this is a form of circularity. People migrate within or across national borders to diversify household incomes and accumulate cash they cannot save or borrow at home, and then return home with the means to solve specific household problems which originally prompted them to move. And I'm reminded here of women domestic workers who go to the Middle East once again, because often, when I ask them what were the main push factors, what were the reasons that they went, they would very specifically, some of them, not all, some of them would very specifically say that I had to get my daughter married. So they would go for 5 years, 6 years, sometimes for 2 years, and come back with a certain amount with which they would build a house, or pay for the wedding expenses of a daughter, or even the expenses to put a son or a daughter through a certain expensive course. So there were very specific needs for which you can go and come back. So these are not permanent kinds of migration, as is thought of when we talk about the structural conditions. That is, that there will be movement which is permanent. That is not necessarily so. It can be temporary but continuous. But then who migrates and under what circumstances, right? I told you in certain conditions, women migrate, but women don't migrate from everywhere. Women migrate from very specific regions. So if you look at the migration of women as domestic workers to the Gulf, you'll find that there's very little of that kind of migration from northern India. Most of this migration is from southern India and western, and some parts of western India, the big cities like Bombay, etc. But it's concentrated in specific areas in Andhra Pradesh. And large scale migration of women from just 2 districts of Andhra Pradesh. And that actually reaches out to a very different kind of explanation. And that's what I'm going to come to next. Okay. So what explains how people move? The fact that young women migrate alone in certain categories, domestic workers, nurses, or women who go. Young women actually go to work in textile and garment manufacturing sectors from certain places, eastern and northeastern states, whereas migration is by family units and other kinship spatial groups from some places, central, eastern, and western states. So you have very, distinct configurations if you were to look at the map of India in terms of who goes where, who goes to do what kinds of work, who undertakes what form of migration, etc. And that it is predominantly single male migration from some places, for instance, the northern states. Now, here I come to why is it that you find that women are able to move from some places. For instance, the example that I gave you about women moving to the Gulf from specific areas of Andhra Pradesh. So what is important here are social structures that arise in the course of mobility. So the first migrants who went, they didn't have these social structures. They didn't have those networks. The term there is networks or infrastructure. But once the original or the pioneer groups go, they actually establish networks. And then as migration deepens, it becomes very easy for people to continuously go from the source regions. So what I found when I was doing field work in East Godavari in Andhra Pradesh was that young people, young boys studying in college would discontinue, after their 10th or 11th, because it was so easy for them to get a job in the Middle East. Their mothers would be working there, their fathers would be working there. So they would very easily go. So it was easier for them to think of migration to the Gulf than it was to think of migration to some other place within the country. And this really is the effect of networks. And it's called social capital theory, which refers to the formation and elaboration of social structures in the course of migration. So this is basically what I've just been talking about. And this is also referred to as cumulative causation of migration. Now, again, this is very relevant to how women move, because women, are at the sufferance in a sense, because male mobility is acceptable, women's mobility is rarely acceptable. But when there are networks, it becomes possible for women to move from particular areas. Now, social capital theory or network theory is very powerful in explaining the uneven geographical distribution of migration and the development of migration corridors. And there's several of these corridors: Bihar to Punjab, agricultural workers, male, eastern and northeastern states to southern states, largely male, but there are increasing numbers of family migrants. Women's migration in this kind of pattern tends to be invisible. It's there, but it's invisible because you don't see domestic workers. So you really have to do a lot of field work, and the source areas, it's very difficult to track them down in the destination area. And yet, Ganjam and Orissa is one of the areas from where women, like Jharkhand, is one of the areas where women do move as domestic workers. But there's large-scale male migration from Ganjam to Surat and Gujarat, and then there is South Asia to the Middle East. However, social capital theory presumes to be gender neutral. In a context of otherwise male dominated migration, how do we explain the migration of young scheduled tribe women as domestic workers from Ganjam and Orissa to the cities and to Kerala, young women's migration as fish workers from Kerala to the western coastal states? So, Kerala is a receiving state, but you'll find that there is migration of poorer women from mostly from the coastal areas of Kerala to the fish processing areas. Now, this is also, going back to the demand side theories. There is a great deal of demand for women from Kerala in this particular occupation, because women in Kerala are believed to be skilled. That's because for many generations they've been undertaking this kind of work. So, but what makes this eminently possible are the kinds of social capital or the networks that exist. Why is migration to the Gulf from India male dominated, whereas it's female dominated from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka? Now, this takes me to my last point in this section on perspectives, which is state policy. So, a very important factor in explaining women's migration, or the differential kind of migration that you find, especially in the context of international migration, because when migration within a country is concerned, the at least the federal government doesn't have such a big role in defining the gendered character of that migration. So women and men can move seamlessly, because the borders, you don't need a passport, right, to cross a state border. So what holds people back is gender conservatism, social norms. And what enables women's mobility are networks and a migratory sensibility, that you've been engaged in migration for a fairly long time, and so migration is familiar to people in the region. But state policy is very important when you look at international migration. So it's of key importance. And the Philippines, one of the reasons why the Philippines has become such a large exporting state of migrant workers, particularly migrant women workers, to the Middle East, but also to other parts, to the OECD, to America, everywhere, is that the Philippines government has been, very focused on migration as an economic development strategy. And it's been doing this since the 1970s. And therefore, Philippines has really gone far ahead of other states in enabling the migration of women. And Filipino women are really visible in the international migratory context. Now, a very interesting thing is the Indian government has not at all facilitated or encouraged, or even had a policy that encourages women's migration. But the competitors for Filipino women as nurses in the West, in the Middle East, etc., are Malayali women from India, women mostly from Kerala. And this has been the effect because of social networks. Because Malayali women have had very strong social networks, because Malayalis were early starters as far as migration to the Middle East was concerned. And therefore the established networks, and it became very possible for my women to move as nurses. And the reason why Malayali women moved as nurses, I would have to go back to the political economy of Kerala, which enabled a certain community to educate their daughters, because they were undergoing demographic transition at a point and there was scarcity of resources, etc. But then they built on that base, and now, of course, it's not only the Christian women who migrate, it's become very diversified. You have Hindu and Muslim women also from Kerala who migrate as nurses. So you find that Philippines, the migration of women's story has been powered really by the government policy, but they've also built up networks. In the case of Kerala, it has been really powered by social networks. And despite the fact that the government, in fact, in the case of domestic workers, the government has been very restrictive. It has imposed bans, it has imposed huge numbers of restrictions, and yet because strong networks exist, women have continued to move. But because the government has not been open, or you adopted a liberal perspective, women have not been able to challenge the kind of social conservatism that they find at home. And therefore, migrant women as domestic workers, but also to a certain extent as nurses, do face stigma in their source context at home. Now, I think, I will just close very soon. Now, in the source countries, migration is an economic strategy that reduces unemployment and raises the possibility of receiving remittances. But immigration and emigration policies are also associated with broader ideological currents in society, tending towards restriction during periods of conservatism and expansion during periods of openness and liberalism. This is a more broad explanation. It applies for men and women both. But we find that conservatism or gender ideology actually could act to restrict women's migration. Even in the Philippines, when the state adopted a proactively and promotional approach, society, there were movements within society that tried to call upon the state to restrict that migration. But the state did not give in, particularly because women who had already started moving mobilized against it. And now, in fact, women who've been moving because they've been migrating for such a long time, they've got a lot of clout. They wield a lot of clout, and therefore they're able to make their demands to the state. Unlike in the Indian context, where because women have been moving almost in an irregular way, illegally, women's voices are not heard in the policy context, and policy is really decided by the larger public domain, the voices, middle class voices that are heard in the public domain, and not by women workers themselves. And this really affects women negatively. Now, just to conclude, I'm going to bring up a way of explaining gender in the context of international migration from the work of a scholar called Nana Uisi, who says that the dominant explanations do not really explain women's migration. If we need to understand women's migration, we need to look at it at three levels: the macro level, which would be state policy; the meso level, which would be the link between the macro and the micro, the community structures, the kind of environment, social environment that exists. What she uses the term social legitimacy, and I refer to stigma. And micro level factors, which is the kind of decision making that exists at the family level. Now, in the Indian context, the macro level, state policy has been very restrictive. But what has, I mentioned that social networks have really worked to enable women to go despite the harsh or the restrictive policies of the state. And here I want to end by referring to a distinction between Kerala and Andhra Pradesh as source regions of migration of domestic workers to the Middle East. Now, what you find is that in Kerala, women who migrate, I mentioned early on that the migration of women who are outside the structures of marital protection, by which I mean that they are not married. So, there isn't that expectation that the male breadwinner will actually take care of the dependent housewife. So women who are divorced or widowed, their migration is condoned. So you find that migration of women as domestic workers to the Middle East from Kerala is really on the social margins, whereas women who are broadly within the mainstream framework, and that's currently married women, there's much greater restriction on them socially to migrate. But in Andhra Pradesh, and if women do migrate, they are subject to stigma. But when I looked at Andhra Pradesh, it was very interesting because the bulk of women who were migrating were currently married. So they had husbands, but they said their husbands had far less prospects as migrant workers. But another feature of migration from Andhra Pradesh is the predominance of Dalit women, of scheduled caste women. And that was also an important factor in determining the migration of women there, because scheduled caste women were already working. The work participation rates prior to migration was much higher in Andhra Pradesh than in Kerala. And they were mostly agricultural laborers. So the expected earnings overseas were far, far more. And another important factor in Andhra Pradesh was that within the sending communities, that is within the scheduled caste communities, there was no stigma on women who migrated. But within the larger social framework, that is, if you went out and you spoke to a shopkeeper or you spoke to the privileged caste people, there was a lot of stigma. So this was a distinction that I found within Andhra Pradesh and between Andhra Pradesh and Kerala. And therefore the decision-making process is very different. Okay, I'm through. Thank you. The decision-making process was very different because there was much more of alignment in decision-making within the families sending women than there was in Kerala. If in Kerala, within families, there would be resistance to sending women, to allowing women to go, unless, of course, they were divorced. So thank you. I'll end with that.
No,
Madam,
no,
that was
that was a noise from somebody else. Anyway, you are concluded, Praveen?
Yeah, I finished. Yeah,
Okay,
I finished.
okay, okay. Now there is a question from Dr. Gopal Singh, please.
Madam, you are mentioning about the subsistence level of wages.
What?
Uh,
Subsistence?
level. That's subsistence.
Huh.
Subsistence level is the level at which they will be able to maintain themselves. Just sufficient to maintain themselves. But here, when we see the migrant women, their wages are below subsistence level. Number one. And number two, you were mentioning about the women who are migrated from Andhra and they are outside the structure of marriage, you were telling. In that study, is it a fact that those women are, though unmarried, they are forced to maintain themselves individually, or they to support their families, so they have to migrate?
Okay. Shall I answer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, no, when I spoke about subsistence, I was talking about the structural transformation. Structural transformation is from a traditionally subsistence economy to an economy that depends more and more on the market. I was not talking about an empirical reality of people living below subsistence. Okay, so that's how migration has been theorized. So migration really occurs in the course of structural transformation of an economy, where you have a movement out from the rural areas to the urban areas, where there is greater opportunity for work and there is opportunity for better earnings as well. So I wasn't talking about the empirical reality of subsistence or not, or going below subsistence. Okay. The second thing is about Andhra Pradesh. Yes. Okay, the second point that you made was about Andhra Pradesh. No, what I said was quite the reverse. It's from Kerala that women go who are, most of the women who migrate to the Middle East are actually divorced or separated or widowed, or not necessarily most, but the single largest segment of them are really outside marital protection. Whereas in Andhra Pradesh, they're currently married women. And it's a family strategy to send to allow women to go and work overseas. So that's what I say.
Yeah, Pravina, okay, I just want a clarification. One
Sure.
is about the bondage, bonded labor, where they take advance. So is it from the generation, as you had been seeing in the past, generations together, they just take and they continue, the legacy will continue, then it is also not just the advance given by the employer, but these workers also take advances because they are in need. So that is what it is happening. So I just want to clarify whether it is only demand side or supply side also. That is one thing. Second is about the social capital. Does that has class implications? Is it only for the middle class and upper, or you have this networking and this social capital happening for the lower class also?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question, it's no, this is a form, what they in the literature they refer to it as neo bondage, which is basically, my understanding of it is that it's from year to year. So before you migrate, the employers are networked with the intermediaries who go and mobilize workers, who give them an advance. And sometimes in the Bricklands, it happens just before a festival season. You give them an advance, you take them to the workplace, and they work at very low wages because they have to pay off that advance. So it occurs from year to year. It's not over generations. Um, and this is true of both sugarcane as well as Brickland.
So this
attaining.
become a strategy for
Yes.
low wage.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes,
Mm.
yes, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
you find that these intermediaries will go to those places where there is agrarian distress. When if it's a drought year, then people just
Okay.
don't have the staying
Advantage
power.
of the such
Yeah,
vulnerability.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
This is
periodically,
happening here in the. I think you would have done that also. The garment sectors, textile sectors, these schemes
yes,
also, no, the camp labor scheme, where people literally go to the villages where you don't have literally employment and drought, recurring drought, etc. So they bring chunk of group of girls, particularly the young
mm,
girls, to this Sumangali scheme. I think
yeah,
you must have, yeah. So
yeah,
they are also they made under the intermediaries or the agents, I should say, the brokers.
yeah.
They play an important role
They play a
in
very important role.
yeah, keeping this chain also going, and they will also locate one girl who is already working here to be the agent, and she will also locate. And so this is the process.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, this is true of children also. Child migrants, this is a major
Yeah, exactly. They
strategy.
don't even get employ them as laborers, but only
Yeah.
apprentices below
Yeah,
14,
and the
15.
parents are paid advances and they send the children. So it's very much with the consent of parents. Though we tend to look at it as trafficking and so on, it's a strategy really to pay off debts and so on. The question about social capital, interestingly, it's not just the middle class. Because the migrants from the East Godavari to the Middle East, they are very poor. But then, because that whole area, that region has so much social capital, so social capital transcends individuals. It becomes a community thing. So,
Oh, good.
when I talk about social capital, I'm not necessarily differentiating family networks from commercial networks, because commercial networks, you know how it works, right? They will talk about people as Annan. Yeah,
Yeah,
Anna.
yeah.
You
Same
know,
is here
you,
also.
yeah,
Mama,
so it becomes,
Mama Seer.
yes, it becomes a form of spatial connections that, translate into a form of social capital. So these are very poor people. They go there because they want to get money to build a house. They don't have a house. They want to go there, but because there's so much of network between the source region and the destination region, like for instance, East Godavari and Kuwait are so strongly connected by networks, it becomes very easy to go. So
That
I'm
is the
not
advantage. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So there is a question here. Do young girls migrate to generate money for the marriage? Do young girls migrate to
Okay.
generate money for their marriage?
Yes,
Kerala
there
is the
are.
example. Yeah.
There are instances. In fact, Tamil Nadu, you mentioned the Sumangali scheme, right? So there are places
The
from
very,
where,
very word itself, Sumangali, it
yeah,
signifies marriage. Yeah.
yeah, and but they are made to work at very low rates, and at the end of the term, they're given what is called something, they call it a bonus, and make you feel like you've earned a big amount because now it's time for you to get married. So they send you back with a certain amount. But even fish processing workers, one of the reasons that they go is because they're able to earn a certain amount, and that can help them to get married. Some young women, but only a very small number, do go to the Middle East before they get married and earn there. There were very specific instances during my own field work where young girls said that their parents were too poor to get them married. So they had gone basically to earn money to pay dowries and so on. So this does occur, but I would not say that it's the single largest reason for why women migrate. Because if you look at one of the biggest channels
Madam,
of
in
young women's
Mexico,
migration is from the north and I mean the eastern parts, Jharkhand, etc., to the cities. But these
Yeah,
young girls are not
Gopal Singh is supplementing something. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Dr. Gopal.
Madam, in one of the studies which I saw, yeah, one of the studies which I saw, people who migrated from Mexico to America, they have in fact increased the economy of America, those migrants. Likewise, any of the studies made in India shows that not only that their economic conditions have improved, but also they have improved the place where they have migrated. Probably, maybe true in case of these Arab countries also. Those who have migrated to Dubai and other places.
Very much.
Is there any study with regard to this? Yeah.
Well, Kerala is an
Any
example.
studies yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there is data that shows that it does lead. I mean, Kerala, like Manimekla said, is a clear instance. But, I would also say that migration has been a huge factor in the improvement of the quality of lives of Dalits in the East Godavari region. Dalits have really gained land. If I haven't done a survey on land or ownership, but you're likely to find that there's been a great deal of transfer of land from the landowning groups to the Dalits. Though, of course, there is still a large amount or large numbers of Dalits who are landless, but there has been a transfer of land ownership because of this migration. And because privileged caste groups like the Kapus and in East Godavari, have not experienced that kind of upward mobility. They've in fact experienced downward mobility, and therefore you may have heard about how the Kapus have mobilized and they're trying to get backward caste status, right? Backward class status. One of the reasons is the kind of downward mobility that they have experienced because they do not endorse women's migration. They see that as stigmatizing. So very few Kapu women will migrate, whereas Dalits migrate en masse.
Yeah, there is one last question and we can wind up. What is the scenario of trafficking for women of India getting migrated overseas as a profession like domestic help or a textile sector at countries like Middle East? Please throw some light.
It depends on what you mean by trafficking, because trafficking is a very nebulous phenomenon. If you're just talking about women who were cheated, they were not told where they were going, they were not told exactly what they would have to do, etc. You'll find that is fairly widespread. Those intermediaries give you all kinds of stories, they take you. But most women do end up in the kind of employment that they are seeking. That is domestic work. There are peripheral instances of women who are promised domestic work jobs and taken into prostitution, into providing sexual services. In some contexts, there are women who actually seek out sex work jobs also. But I think we need to really look at the outcomes in a sense and the experience. How exploitative is it, irrespective of whether they were trafficked or not, depending on what we mean by trafficked. Were you told, were you told, was it transparent? Were you told where you were going? Because there is exploitation across the board. Even if you know where you're going, you're told exactly, everything that you find yourself in, there's still exploitation. And yet, even given that exploitation, the returns are comparatively better than you would find over here. And there is exploitation here as well.
Okay.
That's how I
Thank you.
Yeah. But, madam, in this case, so two aspects. One is the forced say exploitation, or they have been into this trafficking forcibly, or maybe voluntarily also. I think so. Somebody was mentioning about this this trafficking. As you said, that it depends on the concept, whether it is forced or it is voluntary. So that's also true. Yeah. Right.
Those two, these are binary categories, and they're very difficult to work with because of the fact that there are degrees of force and degrees of consent in every decision that we make. It's not as if something is completely forced and completely voluntary. It's often somewhere in between that, and therefore it does not really. It's not very productive to look at that as a question. It's more productive to look at what was the experience that she had. Was she able to actually make good through that experience? Was she able to earn and achieve her objectives? What kind of a job did she find? Those seem to be meaningful questions for me.
I think we can close by this, and there are a lot of positive comments on the chat box. You can, Radhika, you want to say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So it was like people could get introduced to the kind of theories, both the demand and supply theories, and how migration is taking place, the dynamics, and the people were really appreciating the depth. Is it okay? Is it audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So appreciative of your presentation, Dr. Praveena, and really you have covered within the stipulated time given so much, and the different components, the process, and how the migration has been impacting the lives of people, particularly the gender component, which hasn't been touched by many since you have been specialized in that area. You were able to bring it to our very lucid aspect of the focus. And now I invite Ms. Shruti to make the formal vote of thanks. Thank you, Dr. Praveena.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello.
Shruti, yeah, go ahead. Shruti, you are audible.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ma'am. On behalf of the Department of Women's Studies, Bharatidasan University, I present the formal vote of thanks to Professor Praveena Kodat. Ma'am, it's been an excellent speech, and I am really fortunate to be a part of this session regarding the gender lens of migration. You represented a very varied and large span of factors regarding the migration scenario, especially for women in India, in both domestic migration and international migration. And there's been so many intricate issues, like how the family decision is playing a very vital role in women migration, and how the stigma works, and the different social theories, and especially the reason of the women migration. I found that that has been explained very clearly, like women are getting migrated abroad mainly in relation to marriage, and their wage issue and deprivation in that context has come out very wonderfully. And I feel really fortunate and thank you behalf of Bharatidasan University and Madurai Kamaraj University, behalf of all my professors, Dr. Manimekalai, Dr. N. Murugeshwari, Dr. Shubha, and Radhika ma'am from Madurai Kamaraj University. It's been a really excellent experience. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Praveena. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also thank Radhika Reddy for
Thank you, ma'am.
for making
Thank
all the
you.
arrangements, and thank you, Shruti too. Thank you.